So the title of this particular lesson is called Reducing Boilerplate in Our Code, and that's probably kind of a false statement really, because Redux is what it is. We can't really do much about the amount of code that we're writing because there's no getting around the fact that we need constants. We could just make these strings, but constants is the preferred and best practice way to do this, to specify our action types. And then we can't get around the fact that we need to create action creators that return actions. There's no getting around this either. But what we can do is do something about the code inside the reducer. Now, what we're going to look at here is really personal preference, because this works. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this at all, and this is a perfectly valid way of creating your reducers. We pass in the initial state, and if we're not calling any of these actions, then we simply return the state. And like I say, this is absolutely fine. But what I'm going to demonstrate now is what's written in the reducing boilerplate section in the Redux documentation. And it is my preferred way of creating reducers. So what we'll do is we'll create a new folder and call it common. And we'll use this for a few things. And we'll create a new folder inside here called util. And we'll just create another new file inside here called reducerutils.js. And in here we'll create a function and call it export const, and we'll call it create reducer. And this is going to take two parameters. First of all, it's going to take the initial state as a parameter, and inside our test reducer, that's simply what we're returning as our default case. So we're going to take in our initial state as the first parameter, and then the second parameter will be, it's called function map, but we'll take a look at what this is very shortly. It's basically going to be a map of our functions that we create inside here, but we're going to actually create functions rather than just using the cases inside the switch statement. So from this particular function, what we're going to return is the state equal to initial state, and then we'll specify the type, the action type, and if there's a payload, then we'll have this as well. And inside here, we'll add a variable called handler, and this is going to equal the function map, and we'll specify the type inside here. Now remember, this is object bracket notation. So this type is going to be swapped for a string depending on what's passed into this function map that we're passing in. And then from here we're going to return our handler, and we'll add a ternary operator, and it's either going to be our handler with the state and the payload for our actions, or if it's not an action, we just want to return the state, and this will be the equivalent to the default case, then we're just going to return state. And this is our create reducer function. If it's not making any sense now, then what we'll do is we'll go into our test reducer, and I'm just going to comment out all of this, and we're going to use a different approach to creating our reducer. And what we'll do inside here is we'll create functions. So I'll say const increment counter, and these are going to be internal functions to our reducer, so we're not going to export these. And we'll say const increment counter, and we'll pass it state, and inside here what we're going to do is return exactly what we're doing up down here actually. So I'm just going to copy and paste. So we're going to return a new state object, or we're going to return a new object with the current state spread, and then we're going to assign the data property in here, the state.data plus 1, and we're getting our state passed into this as a parameter. And we'll also do the same for the decrement counter, and I'll just copy and paste this one down here and swap that for decrement, and this will be -1. And then what we'll do is we'll use our create reducer function. Instead of exporting default test reducer, we'll export default create reducer, and we'll just bring this in from our reducer utils. So double check this is imported correctly at the top. And in here, the first argument is our initial state, And then the second argument is our function map. And this is going to be an object. And we're going to pass in our type. So we're going to have an increment counter. And we'll assign this the increment counter function that we've just created. And we'll have our decrement counter. And we'll assign this to the decrement counter function we've just created. So if we take a look at this, and I'll just cut this out and move it below just so we can see it a bit more cleanly, is what we've got is exactly the same as what we've had before, and this is personal opinion time, I think it's a bit cleaner. We have functions that that are clearly named, and we can see exactly what we're returning inside this particular function. And when we create our reducer, we pass our function map, so we specify our action types and which function we're calling when this action type is encountered. But it doesn't really save us much in the way of typing, because this is not a huge amount different to what we've got here in terms of how many letters or words we've typed out to achieve the same thing. But I just prefer it because I do believe, and I think, this is a cleaner way of creating our reducers. When we start to add bigger reducers with many, many more functions, then our switch statement can get pretty meaty. So it's hard to demonstrate the benefits right now, but in order to be consistent, this is the way that I'll be demonstrating creating reducers on this particular course. And I'll just remove this, but please feel free to choose whatever your preference is. And if you prefer the switch action, then great, please use the switch action, but I won't be demonstrating that again on this particular course, so I'm going to remove it. And I've said all of this, but what we should really do is make sure we haven't broken anything by doing something a slightly different way. So I'm just going to go back to the application and just make sure that when I decrement and increment, I can see my actions are being implemented and my number increases and decreases. And this all still looks good. So we've written a fair amount of code to increment and decrement a counter, but we've set up the structure of Redux now. And we've come to the end of this particular section, which was introducing and setting up Redux and React Redux in our application. What we're going to move on to next is taking our application and moving our application states into our store. But what we'll do next is just save our changes into source control. And I've got 10 changes here, so I'm just going to stage these and just say end of section 7 and command return and just push these up to the GitHub repository. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at a summary and we'll just recap the stuff that we've covered here, the terminology, the flow of what's going on in Redux. And we'll talk about that in the summary next.